Welcome everyone to today's staff development program. Our speaker today is Amber Alanis. I got that right. She is a doctoral student at the University of Iowa. Before earning an MSW and entering the doctoral program, she worked with Mayor's Youth Empowerment Program as a dual house supervisor in their residential program for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities for 4 years. Other roles held within that committee includes shelter advocate at DVIP and sexual violence prevention advocate at Rape Victim Advocacy Program. Welcome, Amber.
Yay. All right, let me get my screen shared. I'm excited to be here with you all. Since making this presentation, I have earned an LMSW. And so, yeah, let me get this up. And now I'm in my doctoral program. So yes, excited to be here. Let me fix my little screens. There we go. Okay, so yes, this presentation is called Societal Divides, Disability, and Sexuality. My pronouns are she, her, here, but I'm also comfortable with they. So to get us started, I want to explain that I will use various terms of disability throughout this presentation. What I've found is that there's no consensus within the disability community about what is correct. Some people prefer person first language and others use identity first language. So either are fine, and it's important to recognize this from the beginning. If someone with a disability would like to set us up for the presentation and call me out now which one they prefer, I'd ask you to speak out and call me out on that. I also want to ask you all to allow yourselves to be a little uncomfortable today and brave. So here's our introduction activity. Usually I ask folks to drop it in the text or in the chat box because we can't always get everybody's conversation going with just depends on the number of people we have. So if you don't mind adding this into the chat box, your name, pronouns you prefer, other identities you want to share, if you have a major discipline or a work position that you'd like to share, and then tell me some curiosities from today's meeting that you hope to take away. What are you curious to learn from me? And I'm excited to hear about your thoughts on this too. I'll read those here at some point once we get to the videos. So today's agenda. Excluding individuals with disabilities from the discussion and agency of sexuality can be dangerous. I will be sharing several things with you today. I invite you to consider, sit with, and possibly act on these theories. Please type in the chat box all your observations that you want to share, and later in the presentation, I'll be asking you to collaborate, share those ideas, and ask any questions that you may have. This presentation was collected from many different perspectives and expertise, including self-advocates, scholars, community members, allies, parents and guardians, sexuality therapists and educators, and board-certified behavior analysts that often work with children with autism. So this is our schedule. I'm going to ask you to consider, for the most part, I'm asking you to consider what you can do here in the middle. What are the similarities between sexuality and disability, and how can we act on this? So barriers to sexual expression. My camera again. Barriers to sexual expression. So Iowa passed a law in 1915 to legalize sterilizations. Scholars, schools, and community members talk about eugenics as if it's a historical event. However, I argue that it is quite clear that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as other marginalized groups, are still sterilized and asexualized now. The right to parent and raise your biological children is recognized as a fundamental right in the United States Supreme Court. However, as of 1984, in Iowa Supreme Court, it can be overridden on the grounds of the health and safety of the child. Even though it has little relationship, the common basis for removing children from disabled parents is parental IQ level. This is an example of infantilization through policy and law. The welfare system takes harsh perspectives of parents with disabilities. However, there are some proactive disabled parent resources and great advocacy work out there. So, so some of the things I've found, right, I've kind of touched on each of these, but what I found is that the barriers that exist are forced sterilizations and birth control. Some folks don't have access to birth control or aren't even asked if that's an option at their doctor's appointments. Infantilization, we'll talk about a couple examples, but one in particular is how we expect adults with intellectual disabilities to not have sexual identities and relationships. And so we often treat them as babies or children. And in doing that, we remove them from, we remove their children from them is what I'm finding. And so some other inaccessible knowledge and resources for intellectually and developmentally disabled folks includes starting a family. So they don't have information on that. We all don't really have information on what that looks like. LGBTQIA identity, consent, intimacy, safe internet dating, and emotional social skills. Another example is that some people find it really confusing when we're taught to put a condom on a banana as opposed to an anatomically correct doll, because in the bedroom, a banana is useless. And it's confusing when you're told that you need to put a condom on a banana to protect yourself, as opposed to your actual anatomical parts. I have an image over here that describes not all disabilities are visible and people with them are not invisible either. And it displays several different ways disability is expressed. Just because someone looks normal or healthy on the outside, it doesn't mean they do not have a disability. And we'll get to normal here soon. But I wanted to put that out there. And after interviewing, reading, and listening and watching the personal stories, I found there to be many things missing regarding history education, sex education, healthcare access, and the general acknowledgement of disabled people. I asked one individual with an intellectual disability what they learned in school about sex and disability. And she mentioned to me that she learned that she was different than others, that she was not normal. She mentioned how hard it is to be heard and believed by her doctors, her staff, her parents, and her teachers. And, when I was talking to her, as much as that seemed like it was only about her disability, I recognize and believe that it also includes her sexuality because this is how she identifies herself. Her and all of her identities deserve to be holistic and recognized for that. And so some of the desires for sexual expression include pleasure, connection, acceptance, recognition, and accessibility. When I think of pleasure, this could include any of the five senses. So it can be things like enjoying laughing with somebody, chatting with somebody who is smart or funny. Maybe you enjoy that. Something that's appealing to your eyes, or maybe you like the smell of roses. Some folks like the smell of feces or poop. And that may seem wild, right? But pleasure is different for everybody. And sometimes that's based on our sensory intake. Connection. Our clients want to connect, have friends, for everyone to get along. They want to be able to have good Christmases or holidays and to be able to connect with their families. But first, they have to be able to know how to connect. And there've been circumstances when that's been challenging for some of the people I've worked with. And I say these things and I'm telling you these things and I'm telling you other people's stories. And I want to say that any of these stories that I share, I've been given permission to share. And acceptance, to be accepted as who they are, but also being given permission to love themselves and make choices for how they love themselves. Recognition, to be recognized as a sexual human being, as someone who deserves to find themselves, because how can someone do that when they don't always have the language or the typical communication style for it? Well, it can start with us. And by us, I do mean the whole community, but in this idea that I've been referencing, I was referring to staff. So I think staff can also do things, but I think community members can too. Accessibility. People want to have access to this information, but also want sex toys, guardianship approval, staff assistance, and agency support. People with ID, which intellectual disability, claim to need this support to obtain this information and these rights. This has been in personal experiences and in research. So for this section, I usually ask if I can get a volunteer to read these out for me. Can somebody read these for me? Or one of them?
I can read the first one. My name's Liz. Myth 1, because I have a legal guardian, I can't give consent for anything.
Thank you, Liz. Myth number 2.
I can read that one. If I can't communicate in traditional ways, I can't tell you I've been abused.
Thank you. Myth number 3.
I am innocent and should stay that way. I don't need to know about sex.
Thank you. Myth number 4.
If I experience sexual violence, it's usually with a complete stranger.
Thank you. Yeah, and so when I these myths, they came from the Illinois Imagines advocacy program, which is in Illinois, but it's an advocacy program that targets domestic violence for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Specifically, it's been targeted towards women, but that's where these myths and facts come from. So is anybody willing to read the facts for me?
Well, I did myth 1, so I'll do fact 1. I still have the right to speak for myself. Check the laws on it.
Thank you. Fact number 2.
I can still disclose sexual harm or trauma. Watch my body, face, and emotions for signs.
Thank you. Fact 3.
I have a right and a need to know about health, sexuality, and about sexual abuse or assault.
Thank you. And the last fact?
If I experience sexual violence, it's usually with a family member or caregiver.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this last fact, most people are really struck by this because, well, socially, we've been taught that it's going to be with a stranger, right? It's going to be some creeper in the bush. It's going to be somebody on the interstate. And although that happens, it's way more common for it to happen with somebody you know. And in their case, it can be a family member or caregiver. Thank you all for reading those out loud. So control-based current events. This is how I see our current situation. And honestly, unfortunately, it was really recent. Glenwood Resource Center did sexuality research on 200 of their clients. This scandal involved many different perspectives, but all of them asexualized and marginalized people with disabilities. The main issue is that research failed to include the voices of people with disabilities or seek consent from them and their legal guardians, which is exploitation and objectification. The media highlighted buying things like silk sheiks or boxer shorts and stock photos and of pornographic images. Like, how dare they, right? But and these were labeled as the most prevalent problems. Media's representation could create harmful impact on sexual self-advocacy because it comes from a place of fear and control. This puts a halt on the sexual self-advocacy work that I want to uplift, and I worry it will diminish the efforts of it in sexuality services. When it comes to the realities of in this field of work, it's clearly an immense worry that guardians will pull services or that clients will be removed from services if a situation of sexual liability were to arise. As an agency, if we lose services, we could lose economic gain and reputation. I don't think we can really compare human life to value and money, but it's true and should be called out. If coming from a place of economic gain and reputation-driven decision-making is control-based, I wonder how we can get ourselves to support one's quality of life. Staff and agencies throughout history, current events, and research have displayed a need for support and education. We as staff need support because without administration, policy, and training support, we will make decisions based on our own values. not based off of the friends or self-advocates we claim to support. Some researchers believe that this can be done in homes, like in home and community, and home and community-based services, but without staff training, group homes can unintentionally or intentionally police and control their clients' lives. I want you to imagine the ways in which we can create space for empowerment in person-centered plans instead of control. Fear-based. Because there is minimal accessible sex education for people with disabilities, or many people with disabilities continue to be sexually abused and or in abusive relationships. According to the National Crime Victim Survey in 2018, people with disabilities are twice as likely to be victims of violent victimization. Inappropriate touching, such as sexually or aggressive, non-consensual touching too, comes up. So sometimes people will refer to people as sexually aggressive with disabilities because they may not necessarily know how to navigate relationships. Some of these challenges, some other challenges that occur, like right here in the corner, we have a quote from Keisha. Michael lied and said, I wanted to have sexual contact with him. I was informed by a detective later in the week that the case closed since it was a he said, she said incident. For the record, I absolutely didn't want to have any sexual contact with Michael whatsoever. The system had totally failed me, law enforcement, my caseworker, and the case management agency. Excuse me. Other things, like other challenges exist, like due to threats of their well-being or the well-being of their loved ones from the abuser, they may never tell anybody about their abuse. And I'd say that that's common for all folks, not just people with disabilities. There are challenges in making statements to police because people with ID may not be viewed as credible due to having an intellectual disability. And that's just based on the perceptions of who they're talking to. When we come from a fear-based place, we leave room for vulnerability. Without a frame of reference to be able to identify with or be able to replicate a healthy relationship, these folks are left lost and left vulnerable. Current sexuality education is not sufficient enough for people without intellectual and developmental disabilities. Yet, disabled and neurodivergent people deserve accommodations and modifications to this education, as well as their rights. I want to show you a video. Let me pull that up really quick. So stop my share. Here, it's okay. Wait, just one sec. Okay.
And she said, hi, you know, my daughter and your son go to program together and we're going to a dinner dance for our bicycle club and Hava would like to invite Paul as her date. Does he have a sports jacket? And then they just went from there. I thought, well, this will be nice. You know, he'll have a little girlfriend and somebody to do things with on, you know, the holidays or whatever, and not really thinking that it was going to turn into a lifelong relationship, but they were serious about each other.
Honey, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I love you. You be my wife?
My Bible.
Whoa, whoa, oh.
I had tears of happiness seeing Hava look done
walking down the aisle with her mother and with her father. She was so beautiful in her wedding dress. So beautiful. And I couldn't wait to take the veil off and kiss her. It was a magical day.
After they were married, they lived in separate group homes, which was a terrible challenge.
Not happy.
We were not happy not living together. I was sad, I was crying in my eyes and lonely.
Both group homes were very much against having a married couple in their group home. They say here that married couples who experience developmental disabilities generally live on their own, in their own home, being capable of independent employment and financial independence, not to mention the capacity to independently coexist. So this is a way of their saying that Paul and Hava just aren't smart enough to be able to be married and live together.
They would spend usually a weekend at one parent's house or the other, so they could be together all day and all night. And then we'd take them home Sunday night, and Paul would always say, "I'm so sad, Dad, I'm very sad."
It became very common for us to tell Hava and Paul, we're working on it, we're working on it.
There's some other videos I always want to share, but we just don't have time. So Dr. Shapuk is another person with a disability. She's a wheelchair user. She talks about how our world would benefit from adding people with disabilities into sexual identities. And by that, I mean amplifying that they are sexual beings. So acceptance phase. This is where I think we could go. This is future possibilities. This slide holds examples of what sexual expression could look like. There are many things that could pique our interest. What I have learned is that it comes from listening to our body's responses and recognizing a need for self-care. This can, in fact, include sexuality and relationship to connection, relationships, identities, and autonomy. While watching these videos, I invite you to type in the chat box thoughts you had or things you recognize may fulfill wishes and desires from early.
Not fit in.
At 20 feet, you can see what an average person would see at 1,000 feet.
This is Meowlity, and this is Persephone. 23 dolls. Yay! I'm in doll heaven. There's Something About Hamlet by Michelle Smith, an unlicensed psychiatrist who just read the DSM yesterday.
There's a structure here and a regimen here, and all of a sudden it stops. Now you're on your own.
I want to take on the world. The world will be my burrito. So I went and got a job, and then I got fired from it. And I pretty much spent an entire year in my room. I didn't really have any friends except for this one community that I was involved in.
What's this community that you were talking about?
When I first got into this lifestyle, I was convinced that no one would want to play with some blind chick. I'm so happy I was wrong. I want to experience all aspects of life. I want to be able to live on my own. If she finds restraints on my bed or a flogger in my closet, I don't want her to assume the worst.
There never has been a threat of kicking you out. I've never said that to you.
This is my life. I can't live by myself. How am I going to be okay?
Know yourself and know all the challenges you face, and don't put yourself on the sidelines. It is, in fact, up to you.
She's wondering, where do I go from here? What do I do now?
Are you sure I'm not dreaming? I want to see what the world has to offer, even the good, bad, and the ugly. The uncensored world. You know what I mean?
And so that was just one story. And now here is another story. This is a man named Andrew Gurza who discusses, this is a scene that talks about his sexual expression. Let me get there.
All the other stuff a person with a disability needs. Look straight down, sir.
No, that's what we want. We'll be okay with that. Yeah. So that'll be perfect.
It's actually weird because like in the modeling community, there's a lot of people with my disability and we all have issues finding work, even though like when I'm in my wheelchair, I've had old women talk to me like I'm 4 years old and be like, oh, aren't you nice, dear, being out and about? And I'm like, I'm on my way to work. Why are you treating me like I'm 5? I do mostly alternative and fetish modeling where there's a little bit more variety in body types, but it's not always clear in the image that I'm disabled. It's nice to be able to just be like, no, this is just me. So having it front and center and claiming sexuality as a thing that's our right, no matter what our abilities are, is super powerful.
I can move that. I'm gonna move this too. Are you comfortable undoing your shirt? Yeah? Would you be okay taking your jacket off just so I can see your tattoos? That's cool. Put both hands on his shoulders. Is that okay? And then looking back at me. That's awesome.
I'm a little bit spent, but I know I'm gonna get back up and do it again.
Okay. So now I want to ask you all, you can raise your hand and speak out, but I want to ask you, or you can put it in the chat, what wishes do you have for destigmatizing disability and sexuality? When I say destigmatize, I mean to remove shame and disrespect. So what wishes do you all have? Let me check the chat too. Or what wishes have you heard? Talking about disability and sex is normal. Thanks, Patty. What are others' thoughts? different definitions of what is beauty and sexy. Thanks, Sarah. Help provide more accessibility to LGBTQIA plus spaces. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Those are a few things. Let me see. We can do it better in our educational programs. Sure. Yeah. Thank you all. Keep thinking on that. Feel free to raise your hand and speak out about that. But we can move along. So sexual health benefits. These essentially all these coming together are what will allow for sexual health equity, really. So self-determination is defined as the process of taking control and making decisions that affect one's life. This will provide people with the skills and abilities to make informed choices. Sexual autonomy. This is defined as someone's prerogative to determine when, with whom, and under what circumstances they engage in sexual activity. To only engage in sexual activity that which they consent. So that is autonomy. Sexual agency is the ability to give consent to participating in or declining sexual activity and having your desires honored. The right to choosing how you define your sexuality and your identity. And that could be an identity such as LGBTQIA identities. It could also be disability. So to speak about, I should speak about this idea of what is considered autonomy, but other people have referred to it as learned compliance or learned helplessness. And so when we tell people that they are non-compliant, it is our way of trying to get them to do what we want them to do. They have learned that they can only comply, which leads them to build their autonomy off of their support person, their staff, parent, teacher. Some people verbally comply and continue to seek their autonomy secretly or blatantly, right? Like some people might do it in a way where they don't tell people, and other people may absolutely confront you and continue to seek their autonomy. It bleeds into doing activities of all daily living activities. Specifically, one might be laundry. So now I've learned that my staff do my laundry because I've centered my existence around their need for me to comply. This is correlated with high violent victimization within the disability community, such as sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking. It truly just prevents people from being able to stay safe. And not just for those with disabilities. Most importantly, people with disabilities are often the only group of folks that supposedly need support services, when that is just not true. We can all benefit from interdependence. This idea of interdependence, what I mean by that is someone being able to make choices for themselves, as well as receive support and attain those choices and be heard. In fact, that is how neuroscience works. We all need connection and autonomy to function. And this can enhance our mental health. So we could include education on sensory needs like meditation or coping skills and other forms of pleasure. We all need access to what that means for us. Improved physical health, right? So mental health and physical health go hand in hand. When one is out of whack, the other will be too. And there can be found balance between those. So this could include things that could improve your physical health. That might include hygiene or self-care with healthy food options, healthy connections and relationships. This may be something that includes having healthy examples of relationships and connections. This can help someone develop their own skills to maintain and gain this health benefit. We all need role models that can display this for us. When all of these are instilled, one's behavioral challenges will decrease. And challenging behaviors, they're defined as actions that affect the person's quality of life, or they comprise the individual's or others' safety. However, I argue that these are actually trauma responses. And symptoms of trauma may look like challenging behaviors. Building autonomy can and will provide healing for everyone, not just people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And when I say that these behavior challenges are actually trauma responses, I mean that behavior is communication. It can mean so many things, and trauma can look like sensory troubles, can be sensory responses. In fact, trauma is the response to what is happening in an environment. So what can we do? As you have been learning, comprehensive sexuality education is essential for all of us. And I propose that people with disabilities must be included and integrated, because when we all don't learn the importance of the impact of all of these identities, we forget the identity's validity, the respect and dignity we all deserve when we aren't perfect. That's what I mean by the validity. So here are a few things we can do. We can acknowledge, we can amplify, and we can advocate alongside people with disabilities. Here we go. So acknowledge. So we can value things. We can give value to and utilize the evidence-based sexual health benefits. If we add these to our personal and agency core values, it is a step to acknowledging. Recognize. In recognizing that proactive sexuality services are more cost effective, it will be easier to convince legislators and people in power to put it into effect. With proactive sexuality services, we can guide people to do what is healthy and safe. But first, we must acknowledge what is truly unhealthy and unsafe, and if that's regarding our values or not. This shouldn't be solely based on our values. It is also important to recognize that there are communities that continue to be undiagnosed or later diagnosed. Black and Latinx communities are 5 times more likely to be misdiagnosed with conduct disorders prior to being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Implement. We can implement continued staff support. Staff support in guardian sexuality, disability, and rights education or training. There is a place to acknowledge guardianship values, but what about being able to identify their own ability to obtain values and choices? And earlier I talked about barriers for parents and guardians. And I just want to say that although parents, guardians, and staff can be barriers, we can also be the biggest advocates for the people we're working with. It's same with any of our relationships. And so, yeah, there's a place to do that here. How can we as an agency amplify? We can amplify by becoming an ally, and good allies are well informed by those that they want to ally for. This could include asking people with disabilities their perspectives, but it could also include taking time to educate yourself, which you're all doing today by being here. If you are someone who chooses to partake in this advocacy movement, please consider amplifying disabled voices, not replacing them. Additionally, parents can have disabilities too, and often they can go undiagnosed. Our policies and education should be disability friendly. There are resources that can do an excellent example of this, and they're free. Like, you can access them for free. Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is just one that I can mention, or the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. How can we advocate as an agency? One way we can advocate as an agency is through policy change within legislation. Iowa policy describes guardianship written as in the best interest of the person, where in Illinois, the guardian is labeled for substituted judgment for the person. Essentially, with substituted judgment, both parties have equal say over the person's life circumstances. And this doesn't happen when we have it written as the best interest language. We should advocate for substituted judgment and for people with disabilities to obtain their own guardianship for situations that's safe to do. There are several places out there working on this. University of Illinois at Chicago, New York, New Mexico are states working on providing proactive and positive sexuality services within group home settings. They believe this should be included within home and community-based services waivers in order to meet American Disability Act standards. It is also important to insist upon integration and utilization of universal design for learning. This is defined as an educational framework that guides development of flexible learning environments and learning spaces that can accommodate to individual learning differences or challenges. All people need one-on-one support and group instruction. Without both, we lose all perspectives. This includes the validity of those perspectives when they are not allowed in the same classroom, library, bathroom, park, etc. Segregation can happen in other forms that don't include slavery, although that is also one form of segregation. Someone else or something else that we can do as an agency is build coalitions, such as the Safe Circle Coalition. And this is a coalition that had been started in Missouri for people with disabilities to have access to this information. I know that we are pressed for our time and that today is only a small portion of the big picture, but I ask you to imagine the connections we can make within our communities between sexuality and disability agencies and any organization throughout the community. What ethical obligations do we have now that we have this information? We as an established agency have ethical obligations now that we have this information. It can be uncomfortable sitting with this information without choosing to move forward. And please process this in ways that you need to. As an agency that has built great community, we can be open to others' opposing views and meet them where they are at. This graphic lays out why we should move forward with this new information. We are bound to protect and support sexual agency and empowerment. And when I am referring to our power, I mean, how can we use our education, our disciplines, and our community citizenship to make change? This is an issue that is much larger than we can tackle today. However, we are leading the path to acceptance and community support. We can choose to push for influence. This can be done through accreditation, training, certification, research, consultation, toolkits, and resources. So I'm asking you to consider this. And as a social worker, I know that as a social worker, I know that social work can't do it by itself. I know that I cannot do this alone. And so I'm asking those around me in my community to consider how they can do this and how they can play a role. So here, I'm going to ask you all to break out into breakout rooms. We can, let me see the time. Maybe. My phone. 11:18. So I believe we still have time. I would like to maybe have us break out into some groups for about 8-ish minutes and kind of talk about it. You know, how can we acknowledge, amplify, and advocate for disability within your networks? And how can we disrupt ableism collectively? And I know I had given a handout, and so I hope everybody was able to look at that before today's meeting. If not, I'm happy to send it again. But the handout essentially described ableism, this little acronym I have here, and some examples. So I'm going to stop my share, and I'm going to ask you all to break out into groups, and then we'll come back, and I'm going to ask you all to share what you discussed. So let me do this. Breakout rooms. Okay, there should be, let me see, about 2 or 3 of you in a room. So I'm going to open those up now. See you all soon. Okay, we should have everyone back. And I'm wondering what all you talked about. So yeah, feel free to share. What were your biggest takeaways? What are some of your commitments?
Well, Amber, I have to say that we got off on accessibility and universal design.
That's okay.
I think we talked about being committed to making things more accessible for people. And that 8 minutes went really quick because we then started talking about, normalizing sexuality of people with disabilities. And then it was time to go.
No, the 8 minutes go by so fast. I think that these discussions always go by so fast. Yeah, thank you, Patty, for sharing. What were
So
some
back
other tools?
back in the 90s, I was a TA for human sexuality, even before Allison took it over. But we had a video way back then that we would show, and that whole week was dedicated to sex and ability, disability. And I think even like when we broke into our discussion groups after that, some of our students were still just squirming, and it is just so hard. I mean, the class was human sexuality, and every single week they were able to tell me pretty much everything. And then this one week was the week that they squirmed the most, and so that shows how far we have to go, right?
Yeah, for even the group, that would be hopefully accepting of identities. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something else you want to uplift there? Any other thoughts?
I grew up on TV and movies, right? And so when you were showing the clips and everything, I was like, this is great. And I wish there was more stuff and I was trying to think of movies I had seen, and I could come up with a few, Special on Netflix, The Sessions, and the other sister, I think, were the ones I could remember off the top of my head, right? And I was like, if people are more supportive of these stories being told and watching more of them and encouraging Netflix and Amazon and these other streaming services that are now kind of our mainframe for storytelling and film and movies and TV, if we let them know, like, we want more of these kind of stories, we think you need to be producing more of that stuff. I mean, they listen to what their audiences want. They have all these control panels, right? And so if we're more encouraging for these stories being told, then it becomes more mainstream, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I'm hoping we're headed towards that direction. And it seems that we are. Yeah, Love on the Spectrum is a good one too. Thanks, Maddie, for putting that out there. Maddie also says, discussing how we can make library spaces and resources more apparent and accessible, such as improving on digital signage and our learning commons. If issues of sexual assault abuse arise, make sure library guide statements include stats on folks with disabilities, people of color. Yeah, so diverse groups. So yeah, representation matters is what I'm hearing. Yeah. All right, I have one last slide and then I will open it up for questions. So overall, here's my conclusion, is that people deserve to, 1, learn their rights, gain access to their community, 3, recognize all of their identities and the systemic impact of those identities. 4, be able to know all of their choices and affirmatively be able to accept a no and say no. And finally, in learning self-care skills, including boundary setting or pleasure, to independently become the leader of their life. So the conclusion is, you are allowed to exist as you are, recognize it. Ideally, comprehensive sex education would be holistic and no body or identity would be left out. Ultimately, we must use health and safety to guide our judgments, not just our values. And I put this quote out there, although, insanely isn't meant to be used to be offensive or harmful. But I put this quote out there because it reminded me of the friend that I mentioned earlier, who talked about not being normal. And I just find it so amusing that we're all pretending to be normal when we could just be interesting instead. And so thank you all. Disability is the most experienced minority, and it's time for a revolution. This revolution ideally would aim to empower the individual, the family, the organization, the community, the state, and the nation. Tearing down systems of ableism can start with you. I invite you to aim to change systems and barriers to be much more accessible and include our disabled friends. Otherwise, they continue to be forgotten and invisible within these systems. Those with intellectual disability claim they need us. Inclusive research says so. Thank you all. And so, yeah, here's some resources that I recommend for many folks. And I'll share the presentation slides with you all in PDF form so you have this available. And now you're invited to share your thoughts and ask questions.
Leslie, you are invited to share your thoughts
Yep.
with me. Ask me questions and curiosity.
Yes.
Curiosity.
So there's that. Anyway, feel free to share them.